Jeffrey Frank, our second speaker, is a native of Baltimore, a longtime resident of Washington, D.C., where he began his nonfiction career at the late great Washington Star. And after that paper folded, he continued it at the Buffalo, New York Courier Express. And after that paper folded, he spent 12 years at the Washington Post, where he served as deputy editor of the paper's influential Outlook section. The Post survived him. After which he, I'm so sorry that this computer is my downfall today. After which he spent more than 13 years as a senior editor at the New Yorker, which is, of course, how most of us know him today. Where, among other duties, he edited the magazine's Washington Reports and wrote herd on the stable of writers who would qualify as the dream of any editor anywhere ever, I think. Along the way, he's written books. He wrote his first novel, Creep, at age 22. He's more recently authored 3 very well-received novels, The Columnist, Bad Publicity, and Trudy Hopedale. Book Forum described this Washington trilogy as, quote, dark, hilarious stories of motion and stasis on DC's social ladder. With his wife, Diana Krohn-Frank, he translated the stories of Hans Christian Andersen from the Danish in an acclaimed translation. And just last month, Simon & Schuster published the book that we're here to discuss today, Ike and Dick, Portrait of a Strange Political Marriage. Writing in the New York Review of Books, Russell Baker called it as elegant an example of how pleasurable political history can be when written by a skilled teller of fictional tales who has a careful reporter's respect for facts. He also called it top drawers political history, unusually well written. And he also called it an entertaining human tale of generational conflict filled with the elements that enliven popular novels and soap operas. Thomas Mallon of the New Yorker called it one of the best books ever written about Richard Nixon. Please welcome Mr. Jeffrey Frank.
Thank you very much, and apologies again for being late. It's the bus's fault and the traffic's fault, and I've taken the jacket off. We're supposed to be talking about the Eisenhower presidency, but in fact, Evan owns that subject today, and so I'm going to be probably talking a little bit more about the Eisenhower vice presidency, Richard Nixon. And I was interested. I came to this subject because it was for a couple of reasons. One, I was away. Both of these men fascinated me. I grew up in Washington because I was born in Baltimore, and these people were very real for me as a kid. Less Eisenhower, I saw Nixon a couple of times at Griffith Stadium. I would be in the upper deck on the third base side, and then Nixon, as he was finishing up his vice presidency, would be down. He was a real baseball fan, and so these guys were really interested in me. They were real human beings, and this is so. And my challenge in a way was to write about Nixon, who was not the disgraced former president that he is today, but someone different, someone interesting, someone troublesome in many ways, but not the man we see today. You know, I end with that. And I was fascinated by the idea that these two men could get together. The man that is Evan properly described, who was the supreme commander of the Allied forces, one of the few. I think there were only 4 or 5 five-star generals. There are none today. Someone who met Eisenhower in the mid-'60s and worked with him on op-ed piece. I said, "What's he like, friends?" He goes all 5-star. He was the real thing that way. And Nixon, when they got together, Nixon was a 39-year-old first-term senator from Orange County. He'd only served for 2 years, and he was quite controversial. A red hunter. He was best known for having gone after Alger Hiss. And Eisenhower was basically nominated by acclamation. Everybody wanted Eisenhower for president in 1952. Republicans wanted him because they knew he could win, even though there was a fundamental pull toward Robert Taft. And the Democrats wanted him because they knew he could win with him. They were going after him even earlier. They were fearful that Truman would lose in '48, and they were even talking to him then. Jimmy Roosevelt, FDR's son, wanted Eisenhower to run as a Democrat. Paul Douglas, a senator from Illinois, suggested that Eisenhower could run as both a Republican and a Democrat, and then they could have different vice presidents. So it's just he was really popular. He was the man who led the Allies to victory, and he had this great smile, and he exuded warmth. As Evan says, he had this other side of him, but the public didn't see that. Nixon did see it. When Eisenhower picked Nixon, that's almost just that's a verb I shouldn't use, because Eisenhower did not really pick Nixon. Nixon was on a list of people but Eisenhower knew, he met him a couple of times, hardly registered with him. And Nixon was being pushed by Thomas Dewey, others too, but Thomas Dewey, who was the governor of New York then, and really a member of the Eastern establishment. And Nixon was a perfect balance for the ticket. He was a Westerner, he was 39, he was a red hunter, and he was also an internationalist. That was the right wing of the Republican Party that was isolationist. Nixon wasn't. Nixon supported the Marshall Plan in the 40s as a congressman. And he was so Eisenhower really appreciated that. So he was a perfect pick, but they really weren't made for each other, and they had problems from the start. I don't want to go through the episode where the so-called checkers speech, but it's very important to realize that when Eisenhower was running for president in '52, his campaign was based on the idea that cleaning up the mess in Washington. The mess in Washington was Harry Truman. Harry Truman had a really corrupt administration. Harry Truman himself, as far as I know, wasn't particularly guilty of anything. The people around him were taking big coats, there were kickbacks, there were all sorts of things, and deep freezes were being handed out, among others. Best Truman got one of those too, even though it didn't work, which is kind of their alibi for it. And so when Nixon was accused of having a secret fund, it wasn't just a little mini scandal, which it wasn't. It wasn't. In fact, it wasn't even particularly scandalous because it was all pretty above board. But this was completely contrary to the Eisenhower message, which was clean as a house to give the rest of Washington. So Ike really wanted him off the ticket. And Eisenhower, one of Eisenhower's problems or virtues was he really couldn't tell. He had a real difficulty confronting people face to face. During the war, when he wanted to transfer General Patton, he had someone else do it for him, and when he wanted to get Nixon off the ticket, he couldn't say, "Dick, I want you to go." He hid it. He had people call Dick Nixon at the last minute. When Nixon went on television to give a speech to explain himself, he got a call before he went on from Tom Dewey saying, "Eisenhower's advisors think you should resign after you finish your speech." Nixon said, "What does Eisenhower think?" No, he got the answer. So Nixon survived. Nixon saw this weakness in the Navy lieutenant, saw this weakness in the five-star general. And things, so that sort of defined it. And things went on. And I think the moment that really redefined their relationship was 1955, when Eisenhower had a major heart attack. He was really critically ill. No one at the time, no one knew it. The press was camping out at the hospital and so on, and they kind of got hit stuff, and the people around us were quite panicked. Foster Dulles, you can sort of see their memos. It's fascinating. Both at the Eisenhower Library and at the Nixon Library, going back and forth. Foster Dulles was fascinated by what had happened when there wasn't had a stroke. Who was going to be in charge, and you can always sort of see this going on. There was sort of territorial disputes. It finally was agreed that Sherman Adams who was the chief of staff, would go out to Denver to be with Eisenhower for a while. And so this was, but the big thing that it did was to redefine the vice presidency. No one ever thought of vice presidents as heir to the presidency. Now, yeah, right, Joe Biden's thinking he'd be president now. But but that wasn't the case then. When Harry Truman was big, FDR never saw John Nance Garner or Henry Wallace or Harry Truman as his president. These were just placeholders. They balanced the ticket. They did whatever they did. And Nixon was this close to being president. I thought it was really ill. And the New York Times had a story which said never has such a burden, an heir to the presidency fallen on someone so young, which alerted everybody, particularly his enemies, that this was a real thing. And I don't know when Nixon really began to get the idea that he might be president, but it was certainly came very close to that. And I think that he suddenly had to step into this job, and he did it very well. He got praise from absolutely everybody, and that was even those who hated him most thought admired his deference, his care, and so on. And Eisenhower didn't much like it. Here was this, I guess if he was 50, he was 55, he was a 42-year-old California started standing over the bed while Eisenhower was a very frail 62-year-old or 64-year-old then. So it's hard to also think of Eisenhower as his grandfather and guy. When he ran for president in 1952, he was Hillary Clinton's age when she ran in 2008, but he seemed so much older. He had the war, he was smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, which wasn't particularly good for him. I think Howard Snyder, advised him to cut back to 1 pack a day, and he was he'd be fine. And so he was things. And so it was really, so it was sort of fascinating. It was a way to sort of look at these two men by looking through each other's eyes. I got to see Eisenhower through Nixon's eyes, and I got to see Nixon more through Eisenhower's eyes. For Eisenhower, Nixon was staff. Everyone was staff. Whether he liked them or not, they were just, he was the general. He gave orders. He was sort of off in a sort of higher place. And Nixon's office wasn't, vice presidents weren't in the West Wing in those days. They were the only real constitutional job, as Eisenhower said, is pounding the gavel in the Senate. And to Eisenhower's credit, he actually gave Nixon more responsibility during his first term. He did not want him to be like Harry Truman, not even knowing about an atomic bomb that was going to be dropped and so on. So, but you really got the sense of the differences between them. And I say after the heart attack, you really sort of sense Nixon becoming kind of really ambitious and sort of seeing this possibility for the first time. And you saw Eisenhower more and more sensing his own mortality. He would have conversations with his brother, with others, sort of talking about, we're all mortal, and you can't hold onto a flag or whatever that might fall. And he was claiming he didn't want to run. I think he wanted to run. I'm curious to know what Edmund thinks, whether he wanted to run in '56, even then. But he was telling people he didn't think he was going to go for a second term, and that also, of course, made Nixon very nervous, because Nixon, if Eisenhower didn't run again, then whoever was nominated would then pick the vice president, or Nixon would be in play, and then as it turned out, Eisenhower was going to run again, and then he tormented Nixon for months, telling him he didn't want him on the ticket again. But not telling him, but Eisenhower would not say, I don't want you on the ticket, I have a letter, I think you should be Secretary of Defense. I think you should take another cabinet job. And he would talk to the Republican National Committee chairman. You can see these notes, these extraordinarily detailed notes taken by Eisenhower's executive secretary, Ann Whitman. And which Eisenhower said, we should get someone else. He mentioned some senator from Texas. Oh yeah. And then he came up with this bright idea of getting a Democrats governor of Ohio, who was a Catholic, to be on the vice president. And Len Hall, who was the RNC chairman, said, the Democrats have this really attractive guy, Jack Kennedy. They come. So it was all this stuff going on, but finally, again, Nixon survived. And so I just wanted to start finishing saying that doing this thing was really hard, because you had to talk to all these people. And people who were close to Nixon are so protective. And Eisenhower people were more open. They were willing to talk, and you could find them, and surprisingly, a number of them are still alive. I talked to William Scranton, the governor of Pennsylvania. He was 92 years old when I talked to him. He was able to all these fabulous recall. I talked to a guy named William Bragg Ewell Jr., who worked with Eisenhower on the memoirs, and he was with him. So you could see all this stuff. And with Nixon, it took me 2 years to get to talk to David and Julie, who were, and Tricia's husband, Ed Cox. Tricia would not talk to me. And they were wonderful. Then Julie stopped talking to me, but she was always very friendly. She would introduce me to people and so on. And then I had to deal with, the Eisenhower Library was terrific, they're open, they're part of the National Archives. The Nixon Library is both. There is a bifurcated organization with the National Archives running the library, and a man named Tim Naftali, who is now left, was running it sort of, his assumption was Nixon was pretty evil, and he had a strong blood to it. The foundation, which shares the same building, was sort of more celebratory Nixon. I had to work with all of them. The archives was no problem, but I had to get the foundation to trust me, and I wanted them to trust me, and I wanted to be fair. And they gave me people, I was able to talk to people who no one had ever talked to before. Rosemary Wood's assistant, a woman named Marge Acker, I talked to her several times, and she was amazing. She'd been on the train with Nixon after the Checkers speech, or before the Checkers speech, while all this was going on, and then he was with Nixon when he gave the speech, and she was with Nixon when he had to fly to Wheeling just to see Eisenhower. And I was able to talk to a woman who had worked in Nixon's office in Congress in the 40s. Julie introduced me to her at one of these February group things where all the alumni would come. And she said, oh, well, please call me, we'll talk later. And I said, sure, let's just have a few minutes now. And I had a tape recorder, and she got it later. So you have people like you, there's a lot of mortality that you sensed out there all the time going on. People get old. People sometimes die when they're old. Anyway, so that was a fascinating story. And watching this thing evolve between them through Nixon losing the presidency, Eisenhower having 2 more serious illnesses when he was president, and then having them not grow closer together afterward, but they were they had something in common. They were in touch. They were definitely both serious Republicans. They were both appalled by the idea of the Barry Goldwater campaign in '64. And then in '66, and Nixon had taken himself out of it until Jack Kennedy was killed, and then everything changed for Nixon. Then by '66, Nixon was very much back into it. He was like a chess player. He could see ahead. He could already see '68 coming up, and he campaigned hard for Republican Congress. He had a triumphant thing. Meanwhile, his daughter Julie was dating Eisenhower's grandson David. David was going to Amherst. Julie was going to Smith, 7 miles away. They fell madly in love with each other. And they announced their engagement a year later when they were 19. They were 18 when they first started dating, and they got married a month after Nixon was elected in '68. And they're still married today. It's 45 years next December that they were married. 46 years. But anyway. They were married a long time. They have 3 kids, and so they're and I followed this. I have an epilogue that deals with Watergate, deals with Vietnam, it deals with all the stuff that came later. But basically, it ends. The circle is complete. Nixon and Eisenhower really knew each other in 1952. In March 28th, 1969, Eisenhower dies, and the man who put the wreath on his casket after all these years was President Richard Nixon. And that's sort of how it ends, plus an epilogue. That's sort of.
Very good.